Between 1789 and 1898, nearly all of Latin America broke free from European powers, while the United States expanded from a coastal nation to a continental power spanning from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The fight for freedom and control was bloody and relentless, but through war and perseverance, the map of the Americas transformed completely. Here's what life was really like during the rise of the American nations. Before we start, if these help you sleep, a like or subscribe would be cool. Also, drop where you're listening from and the time. I check the comments and it's crazy seeing people from like Australia and Norway on the same video. Okay, tonight it's the rise of the Americas. But hold up, get comfortable first. I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Your eyes open to darkness. The air is thick with wood smoke and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. It's 1789, and you're not waking up to the gentle ping of a smartphone alarm, but to church bells in a Spanish colonial town somewhere in the Americas. The rough wool blanket scratches against your skin as you sit up on your straw mattress. If you're lucky, you're a Creole, born in the Americas but of pure Spanish descent. If you're not, you might be a mestizo, a mix of Spanish and native blood, or worse, a slave or an indigenous person with virtually no rights at all. And the thing is, this rigid social hierarchy is about to crack wide open. So here's the deal. At the dawn of the 1800s, the map of the Americas looked nothing like it does today. I know, shocking, right? North America had this brand new experiment called the United States hugging the Atlantic coast. The Spanish controlled most of the continent from California to Argentina, and the Portuguese had this massive chunk called Brazil. Oh, and the British were still hanging around in Canada, eyeing their former colonies like an ex who can't move on. But beneath the surface, holy shit was there tension. You know when you can just feel something's about to snap? That was the Americas in 1789. The American Revolution had just shown that, hey, maybe Europeans don't have to rule everything over here. And then, plot twist. The French Revolution kicks off, and suddenly revolutionary ideas are spreading like wildfire. Picture this, Mexico City, 1789. It's the largest city in the Americas with about 130,000 people. The streets are a chaotic mix of splendor and squalor. Grand cathedrals and government buildings tower over narrow, winding streets where sewage literally runs down the middle. No joke. People used to shout, "Agua va," water coming, before tossing waste out the window. And you thought your apartment building was bad. The stench is unbearable, a European visitor wrote in his diary. How people of quality manage to live here is beyond comprehension. But here's the weird part. Despite the smell and the chaos, the Spanish colonial cities were actually better planned than most European ones. They had these perfect grid layouts with a central plaza, a cathedral, and government buildings. It's just that, infrastructure wasn't exactly priority number one for the colonial powers. They were too busy shipping gold and silver back to Europe. Speaking of which, let me paint you a picture of how the whole system worked. So, let me get this straight, says a newly arrived Spanish official to his colleague. We take their gold and silver, ship it back to Spain, and in return, we sell them manufactured goods at inflated prices. His colleague nods, sipping his wine, and we only let them trade with Spain. It's been working for 3 centuries. Genius, the new guy laughs. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turns out. Everything could go wrong. See, by the late 1700s, this system was seriously pissing off the Creole elite, those Spanish-blooded but American-born folks who'd accumulated wealth and education but couldn't get the top government jobs. Those plum positions were reserved for peninsulares, people born in Spain who came over. I spent way too long researching the social hierarchies of Spanish America for this. Like, concerningly long, but it matters because this whole rigid caste system was the powder keg that eventually blew the whole empire apart. At the top you had the peninsulares, Spanish-born officials and merchants who made up maybe 1% of the population but held all the political power. Then came the Creoles, American-born, but of pure Spanish blood. These folks owned the haciendas, huge agricultural estates, and mines. They had money, but were basically second-class citizens politically. Below them were the mestizos, mixed Spanish and indigenous. They worked as artisans, shopkeepers, and lower-level bureaucrats. Then mulattoes, mixed Spanish and African, often working as skilled labourers. Finally, at the bottom, indigenous peoples and African slaves who did all the brutal labour that made the whole system run. My father owns half the silver mines in Potosi, a young Creole complains to his friends at a Mexico City tavern in 1795. I studied law in Madrid, yet some glorified clerk fresh off the boat from Seville gets appointed to the audiencia while I'm passed over again. His mestizo servant, pretending not to listen as he pours more wine, files this information away. The cracks are showing. Meanwhile, up north, the United States was dealing with its own growing pains. The revolutionary fervour had settled into the mundane business of actually running a country, and it wasn't going great at first. Imagine waking up in Philadelphia in 1789. The city's about 42,000 people, which made it the biggest in the United States at the time. You're probably in a small wooden house, maybe 2 rooms if you're lucky. The smell of baking bread mixes with the less pleasant aromas of horse manure and open sewers. If you're wealthy, you might have a brick home with glass windows, but most people were making do with oiled paper to keep out the elements. The Constitution has been ratified, but will it hold? A newspaper editor asks as he sets type for the day's edition. There are already whispers of secession in some quarters. The infant United States was basically held together with hope and string. The Articles of Confederation had been a disaster, and the new Constitution was untested. People identified more with their states than with this new federal government. And the economy? Complete shambles after the war. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the financial genius with questionable people skills. So your plan is to assume all the state's debts and create a national bank? President Washington asks, looking skeptical. Yes, sir, Hamilton replies crisply. It will bind the states to the federal government and establish our credit with European powers. And this won't give too much power to the central government. Hamilton's silence speaks volumes. This debate between federal power and states' rights would define American politics for, the next century or so. No big deal. But here's something wild about daily life back then. The lack of what we'd consider basic necessities. Forget indoor plumbing or electricity. Most Americans in 1789 were farmers who produced almost everything they needed themselves. They grew their food, made their clothes, built their furniture. Cash was scarce, and most business was done through bartering. Morning started at dawn, not because people were early risers, but because candles and oil lamps were expensive. You worked with the sun. Women's work was particularly brutal, cooking over an open hearth, no easy bake ovens here, making soap from lye and animal fat, which could literally burn your skin off if you weren't careful, spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing clothes by hand, preserving food, and of course raising a dozen kids because, high infant mortality meant you needed backup children. You know what's crazy? Teeth. People's teeth were absolute disasters. By age 40, most Americans had lost most of their teeth. George Washington was inaugurated wearing painful, ill-fitting dentures made from ivory, gold, and, I kid you not, other people's teeth. Not like those pristine white choppers you see in the portraits. The president's new teeth pain him considerably, his secretary writes. He can barely close his mouth and speaking is quite difficult. Washington nods grimly, unable to respond. Back in Latin America, things were about to get interesting thanks to a short, ambitious Frenchman, Napoleon Bonaparte. See, in 1808, Napoleon decided to invade Spain and Portugal. He forced the Spanish king to abdicate and put his own brother Joseph on the throne. This threw the Spanish Empire into total chaos. Suddenly, colonial officials didn't know who they were supposed to be taking orders from. The captured Spanish king or this French usurper. This was the opening the Creoles had been waiting for. "We remain loyal to King Ferdinand," announced the Cabildo town council of Caracas in 1810, dominated by Creoles. "But since he is imprisoned by the French, we must govern ourselves until his return." Wink wink, nudge nudge, similar juntas, governing councils, popped up across Spanish America, all supposedly loyal to the imprisoned Spanish king, but increasingly acting like independent governments. In Buenos Aires, a lawyer named Mariano Moreno is sitting at his desk, quill in hand, drafting declarations for the new junta. "We claim to be loyal to Ferdinand," his colleague observes, "but these policies you're drafting look suspiciously like independence." Moreno barely glances up. "How observant of you. Perhaps keep that observation to yourself, yes?" The revolution was beginning, but in this weird roundabout way where nobody wanted to be the first to actually say the word independence. Meanwhile, in Haiti, which, fun fact, was the second independent nation in the Americas after the United States, a full-blown slave revolution had succeeded in 1804. This absolutely terrified slave owners throughout the Americas, especially in the southern United States, where almost 40% of the population was enslaved. Imagine waking up on a cotton plantation in Georgia in 1810. If you're white and own the plantation, you live in relative comfort in a large house with servants. If you're enslaved, you're crammed into a crude cabin with dirt floors, waking before dawn to begin another day of back-breaking labor. "Did you hear about Haiti?" one enslaved man whispers to another as they work the fields. "They overthrew their masters." "Quiet," the other hisses, the overseers watching. The fear of slave rebellions hung over the American South like a storm cloud. In 1800, an enslaved man named Gabriel had planned a major uprising in Virginia. The plot was discovered, and Gabriel and 25 others were hanged. But the message was clear. The institution of slavery was sitting on a powder keg. Back in Spanish America, a young Venezuelan aristocrat named Simón Bolívar was watching all these developments with intense interest. After studying in Europe and witnessing Napoleon's coronation in Italy, he returned home with his head full of revolutionary ideas. In a dimly lit room in Caracas, Bolívar leans over a map spread across a table, surrounded by fellow Creoles. "Gentlemen," he says, his voice low but intense, "the moment has come. Spain is weak. We will never have a better opportunity." One of the older men looks nervous. "But to openly declare independence, the Peninsulares will fight. Blood will be shed." Bolívar's dark eyes flash. "Blood is the price of liberty, my friend. Are we willing to pay it?" The silence that follows is his answer. Up in New England, daily life looked quite different from the plantations south. Small family farms dotted the landscape, along with growing mill towns where the early seeds of American industry were taking root. The day begins before dawn in a farmhouse in Massachusetts. A family of 7 shares 2 beds in a single room. The father and oldest son head out to tend the fields while the mother and daughters begin the endless cycle of domestic work. The youngest children collect eggs and feed the chickens. "Will you be going to the new textile mill, Abigail?" the mother asks her oldest daughter as they knead bread dough. "Mr. Johnson is offering $2 a week," Abigail replies. "More than I could make sewing at home." The mother's face shows mixed emotions, pride at the extra income, worry for her daughter working among the noisy, dangerous machines. These textile mills were changing the face of New England. Young women called mill girls left farm life to work in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. The hours were long, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, but the wages offered independence unknown to previous generations of women. Out on the frontier, which at this point meant western Pennsylvania and Kentucky, life was even more rugged. Dawn breaks over a small clearing in the Kentucky wilderness. A log cabin sits at its center, smoke curling from the chimney. A man emerges, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line before heading to the crude barn to milk the cow. Inside, his wife stirs a pot of cornmeal mush over the fire. Their 4 children sleep on pallets around the single room. "Indians spotted near the Wilsons' place yesterday," the man says when he returns. His wife's hands freeze for just a moment. "Friendly?" "Shawnee, moving north." He sets down the milk. "Should be fine if we don't provoke them." The tension of frontier life was constant, not just from Native Americans, who were understandably not thrilled about settlers taking their land, but from the harsh conditions themselves. Medical care was basically non-existent. A broken leg could be a death sentence. Childbirth was terrifyingly dangerous. And winter? Winter was the season everyone dreaded. Imagine this. It's January 1800 and you're in a log cabin on the frontier. The temperature has dropped to well below freezing. Your cabin is essentially one room with a fireplace, and heat doesn't exactly distribute evenly. The side facing the fire might be relatively comfortable, but a few feet away, water freezes in the bucket overnight. You sleep fully clothed under every blanket and animal hide you own. If you're lucky and relatively wealthy, your cabin has wooden floors. If not, you're living with packed dirt that turns to mud whenever snow melts off boots. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Your nearest neighbour might be miles away. No phone, no internet, not even regular mail service. If something went wrong, illness, injury, attack, you were on your own. "Sometimes I don't see another soul besides my family for months at a stretch," a frontier woman wrote in her journal. "The silence of the forest can make you forget the sound of your own voice." But despite, or perhaps because of, these hardships, Americans were developing a distinct national character, self-reliant, practical, and increasingly different from their European ancestors. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president, marking the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in the new republic, something we totally take for granted now, but was a really big deal at the time. Meanwhile, in Latin America, the rumblings of revolution were growing louder. In Mexico, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo was secretly meeting with other Creoles, planning an uprising against Spanish rule. In a small room behind the church in the town of Dolores, Hidalgo speaks passionately to a group of conspirators. "It is not just independence we seek," he says, his eyes bright with conviction, "but justice for the indigenous and mestizo peoples, an end to slavery, land reform." A wealthy Creole shifts uncomfortably. "Father Hidalgo, we support independence, but these other ideas, they go too far." Hidalgo fixes him with a stern gaze. Then perhaps your vision of freedom is too narrow, senor. This tension between conservative Creoles who wanted independence but with social structures intact and more radical leaders who envisioned deeper changes would shape the coming revolutions throughout Latin America. By 1810, the stage was set for dramatic change across the Americas. The Spanish Empire was reeling from Napoleon's invasion. The United States was expanding westward, doubling its territory with the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And throughout the hemisphere, new ideas about liberty, equality, and nationhood were taking root. The morning light filters through the windows of a Creole mansion in Buenos Aires. A man stands before a mirror, adjusting his cravat. Today is May 25th, 1810, the day the Cabildo will meet to decide whether to form a junta to govern independently from the Spanish-appointed viceroy. "Are you certain this is wise?" his wife asks, watching him from the doorway. "The viceroy has the military." "The military is full of Creoles like me," he replies, meeting her gaze in the mirror, "and we have had enough of Spanish rule." As he steps out into the Buenos Aires morning, the air feels electric with possibility. In the central plaza, crowds are already gathering, demanding change. The old order is about to collapse, and a new chapter in the history of the Americas is about to begin. Not like your warm, comfortable bed right now with no revolutions to worry about, just the gentle sound of my voice telling you about a world that changed forever in the span of a single lifetime. The dawn of the 1800s saw a hemisphere on the edge of transformation. The seeds planted by the American and French revolutions were about to bear fruit across Latin America, while the young United States was taking its first uncertain steps as a nation. For ordinary people throughout the Americas, from enslaved Africans to indigenous peoples, from frontier settlers to city dwellers, daily life was about to change in ways they could barely imagine. And the men who would lead these changes, Bolivar, San Martin, Jefferson, Madison, were preparing to step onto history's stage, but that's getting ahead of our story. The real fireworks are about to begin. The morning of September 16th, 1810 started like any other in the small town of Dolores, Mexico. The church bell rang as usual, but this time it wasn't calling people to mass, it was calling them to revolution. Father Miguel Hidalgo stood before the growing crowd, his voice carrying across the town square. "My children," he shouted, "a new dispensation comes to us today. Will you free yourselves? Will you recover the lands stolen from your forefathers?" The crowd roared. "Will you defend your rights as true patriots?" "Viva Mexico!" someone cried, and the chant spread like wildfire. This was the Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores, that kicked off Mexico's 11-year struggle for independence. And it wasn't going to be pretty. See, what's wild about Latin American independence is that it wasn't just a fight against Spain. It was several civil wars happening at once. Creoles fought Peninsulares, conservatives fought liberals, indigenous people and enslaved Africans fought for their own freedom within the wider fight for national freedom. Basically, it was a hot mess. Hidalgo quickly gathered a massive army, mostly indigenous and mestizo peasants armed with machetes, slings and a few stolen guns. They were angry, and they had every reason to be. Decades of exploitation, famine and brutal treatment had left them with nothing to lose. "Why do you follow this priest?" a Spanish officer asks a captured indigenous fighter. The man's eyes harden. "Because he promises us land. Because he says we are men, not animals. When was the last time a Spaniard said that to me?" The Spanish officer has no answer. Hidalgo's army swelled to nearly 80,000, absolutely massive for the time. They captured the city of Guanajuato and went on a rampage, killing hundreds of Spanish and Creole residents. It was bloody, chaotic, and scared the hell out of the upper classes, even those who sympathized with independence. "This isn't revolution," a wealthy Creole tells his wife as they flee the city. "This is revenge." And he wasn't wrong. 300 years of oppression doesn't lead to polite political change. It leads to violence. The Spanish eventually regrouped and defeated Hidalgo's untrained army. Hidalgo was captured, defrocked, and executed. His head was hung from the granary in Guanajuato as a warning to other would-be revolutionaries. Didn't work. Another priest, José María Morelos, took up the cause. More disciplined and politically savvy than Hidalgo, Morelos formalized the independence movement, calling for abolition of slavery and equality of all citizens. Again, this freaked out many conservative Creoles who wanted independence, but with them at the top of the social hierarchy. Meanwhile, down in South America, things were heating up too. Imagine standing on the bank of the Paraná River on May 18th, 1811. The sun beats down as you watch a small flotilla of boats carrying the makeshift patriot army of what will eventually become Argentina. They're heading to confront Spanish loyalist forces in Paraguay. The general, Manuel Belgrano, paces the deck of the lead vessel, deep in thought. One of his officers approaches. "General, the men are asking why we fight. Many have families in provinces still loyal to Spain." Belgrano gestures at the vast, wild landscape stretching around them. "Tell them we fight so that this land belongs to us, not to masters across an ocean. Tell them their children will be citizens, not subjects. The war for South American independence would be long and complicated, involving two of the most fascinating figures in American history, Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín." While all this revolutionary action was happening in Latin America, the United States was dealing with its own problems. The tension between Britain and France had pulled America into a bizarre situation where both European powers were interfering with US shipping. Britain was even impressing American sailors, basically kidnapping them and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. "They took my son right off the deck of our merchant ship," a weathered sailor tells his companions in a Boston tavern. "Said he was a British deserter. He's never even been to England." One of his friends slams his tankard down. "President Madison needs to do something. We didn't win our independence just to be pushed around like this." Madison did do something. In 1812, the US declared war on Britain, a ballsy move considering Britain was the world's superpower at the time. The War of 1812 was a weird conflict. The Americans tried to invade Canada and got their asses handed to them. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. The US won a few notable naval battles, which was surprising since the British Navy was supposedly invincible. And the whole thing ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which basically said, let's pretend this never happened and go back to how things were before. The weird thing is, Americans treated it like a massive victory. This was partly because news travelled so slowly that the biggest American victory, the Battle of New Orleans, happened after the peace treaty was signed. No one there knew the war was already over. The morning after the Battle of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson walks the battlefield, surveying the carnage. Over 2,000 British soldiers lie dead or wounded compared to just 13 Americans. "My God," his aide whispers, "we've actually defeated the British regulars." Jackson's weathered face shows little emotion. "Remember this, they said American farmers and frontiersmen couldn't stand against European professionals. They were wrong. That victory turned Jackson into a national hero and eventually propelled him to the presidency. But more importantly, it gave Americans this swaggering sense of national pride that would fuel their westward expansion. Back in South America, Simón Bolívar was having a rough time. After early successes, his revolutionary forces had been defeated and he fled to Jamaica. But in 1816, he made a comeback that would change history. Picture this, a small flotilla of ships approaching the Venezuelan coast in 1816. On the lead vessel stands Bolívar, now 33 years old, scarred by defeat but more determined than ever. He's just secured support from the newly independent Haiti, the first nation to recognize Venezuela's bid for independence. "What if we fail again?" asks one of his officers as the shoreline comes into view. "Then we will try again," Bolívar replies, "and again, until we succeed or until I die." Bolívar wasn't just fighting for Venezuela, he dreamed of a united Spanish America, a single great nation stretching from Mexico to Argentina. It was an almost impossibly ambitious vision. Meanwhile, in the southern cone of South America, another revolutionary leader was making his move. José de San Martín, who had fought against Napoleon in Spain before returning to his native Argentina to join the independence struggle, was planning something that seemed utterly insane: crossing the Andes Mountains with an army to liberate Chile and then moving on to Peru, the center of Spanish power in South America. The Andes crossing was one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. We're talking about 5,000 men, thousands of horses and mules, artillery pieces, supplies, all going over mountain passes up to 15,000 feet high, where the air is so thin you can barely breathe, and temperatures drop below freezing at night. Imagine you're a soldier in San Martin's army of the Andes. Dawn breaks over the mountain camp, revealing a brutal landscape of rock and snow. Your lips are cracked from the cold, your lungs burn with each breath in the thin air, and you've already watched dozens of your comrades succumb to the conditions. "How much further?" you ask the mountain guide as you saddle your mule. "2 more days to the summit," he replies, "if the weather holds, then another week down the other side." And if the weather doesn't hold, the guide just gives you a grim look and walks away. Somehow, San Martin's army made it across. They surprised the Spanish forces in Chile, defeated them at the Battle of Chacabuco, and liberated Santiago. Chile was free, but San Martin knew the job wasn't done. As long as Peru remained in Spanish hands, the independence of Argentina and Chile would be threatened. So he built a navy, sailed up the coast, and in 1821 declared the independence of Peru. Around this same time, Bolívar was fighting his way across northern South America. He liberated Colombia in 1819 and Venezuela in 1821. Then, in one of history's most dramatic moments, Bolívar and San Martin met in Guayaquil, Ecuador in 1822. No one knows exactly what was said in that meeting, but we do know that after it, San Martin retired from public life and went into exile in Europe, leaving Bolívar to continue the fight. "Why did you step aside?" San Martin's aide asks as they board the ship that will take them away from South America. San Martin gazes back at the receding shoreline, because South America is not big enough for both Bolívar and me. With San Martin gone, Bolívar completed the liberation of Peru and created a new country called Bolivia, named after himself, which is a power move if I've ever seen one. By 1825, Spanish control over the American mainland was effectively over. Let's pause and think about what this means. In the span of about 15 years, an area larger than Europe broke free from colonial rule. New nations were born: Mexico, Haiti, Gran Colombia, which later split into Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. It was a geopolitical earthquake. But independence didn't solve the fundamental problems these new nations faced. Colonial rule had left them with weak institutions, deep social divisions, and economies dependent on exporting raw materials. The next century would be marked by instability, civil wars, and struggles to define what these new nations would become. While Latin America was fighting for independence, the United States was pushing westward at an incredible pace. Imagine waking up in a wagon somewhere in what would later become Indiana around 1820. Your family left Pennsylvania 6 weeks ago following the national road westward. Everything you own is in this wagon or the pack mule trailing behind it. Your father has a land grant certificate tucked in his coat pocket, 160 acres of virgin forest that will be yours if you can clear it, build a cabin and farm it for 5 years. It sounds like a lot of land, and it is, but most of it is dense woodland that has to be cleared by hand. Pa, when will we get there? You ask as you help hitch the oxen to the wagon. 2 more days, God willing, he replies, squinting at the rising sun. Then the real work begins. The real work was back-breaking. Settlers had to clear forests with hand axes, pull stumps with teams of oxen, build cabins from the felled logs, and break the soil for planting, all before they could even think about growing food. And the isolation was crushing. Your nearest neighbour might be miles away. No doctors, no teachers, no community except what you could create from scratch. I haven't spoken to another woman in 3 months, a frontier wife writes in her diary. The silence is sometimes more than I can bear. Disease was rampant. Malaria in the summer, pneumonia in the winter, childbirth without medical care. A simple cut could get infected and kill you in days. My Sarah died yesterday, a settler writes to his family back east. Childbed fever. The baby died with her. I buried them under the oak tree. Please tell mother I tried everything I knew. Not exactly the romanticized version of frontier life you see in movies, but people kept pushing west because the promise of land, their own land, was irresistible after generations of being landless labourers or tenant farmers in Europe or the eastern states. By 1820, the United States had 22 states, stretching as far west as Missouri. The population had nearly doubled since 1790, reaching about 9.6 million people, including nearly 1.8 million enslaved people. And that brings us to one of the darkest aspects of America's growth. As the country expanded westward, the institution of slavery expanded with it. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made cotton production wildly profitable, and planters rushed to establish new plantations in the fertile lands of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This created an insatiable demand for slave labor. We need 20 more hands for the new fields, a plantation owner tells his overseer as they survey freshly cleared land in Mississippi. The traders have a shipment coming from Virginia next month, the overseer replies. Good strong workers, they say. The plantation owner nods. Make sure we get our pick before the Johnsons. I hear they're expanding too. They're talking about human beings as if they're farm equipment. That's how thoroughly the system had dehumanized enslaved people. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for thousands of years were being systematically pushed aside, killed, or forcibly relocated. Dawn breaks over a Cherokee village in northern Georgia. A tribal elder sits outside his cabin, watching the sun rise with troubled eyes. His grandson joins him. "Grandfather, will we have to leave?" the boy asks. He's heard the adults talking about the white settlers encroaching on their land. The old man is silent for a long moment. "Our people have lived here since the time of the first stories," he finally says, "but the white man's hunger for land is never satisfied. I fear dark days are coming." He was right. By the 1830s, most eastern tribes would be forcibly relocated to territories west of the Mississippi in what became known as the Trail of Tears. But that's getting ahead of our story. Back in Latin America, the newly independent nations were facing their own challenges. The wars of independence had devastated the economy. Infrastructure was in ruins. Political institutions were weak or non-existent. And perhaps most problematically, the social structure hadn't fundamentally changed. The Creole elites who led the revolutions simply replaced the peninsulares at the top of the hierarchy. Indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and poor mestizos saw little improvement in their daily lives. Bolivar, who had dreamed of a unified Spanish America, watched in dismay as Gran Colombia fractured into separate nations. Regional interests, personal ambitions, and the sheer difficulty of governing such a vast and diverse territory made his grand vision impossible. In 1830, sick and disillusioned, Bolivar died of tuberculosis. His last words reportedly were, "America is ungovernable. Those who have served the revolution have ploughed the sea." Pretty depressing final thought from a guy who liberated half a continent. The 1820s saw the emergence of a doctrine that would shape relations between the Americas and Europe for generations to come, the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, President James Monroe declared that the American continents were not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. In other words, Europeans, keep your hands off the Americas. It was a bold statement, considering the US didn't actually have the military power to enforce it at the time, but Britain, with its powerful navy, tacitly supported the policy because it helped keep their European rivals out of the Americas while still allowing British commercial dominance. For the newly independent Latin American nations, the Monroe Doctrine was a mixed blessing. On one hand, it helped protect them from European reconquest. On the other hand, it signaled the beginning of US hegemony in the hemisphere. The Americans say they protect us from Europe, a Colombian diplomat remarks to his Mexican counterpart over brandy in a Bogotá salon. But who will protect us from the Americans? His companion chuckles darkly. Perhaps we have merely traded one master for another who lives closer to home. Not like your cozy bed right now with no worries about independence movements or land-hungry neighbours, just the gentle sound of this story to carry you along. By 1825, the map of the Americas had been transformed. Where once there had been just a handful of European colonies, now there were many independent nations finding their way in the world. The Spanish Empire in the Americas, which had lasted for 3 centuries, had collapsed in less than 2 decades. The United States, meanwhile, was growing in population, territory, and confidence. The era of good feelings under President Monroe gave Americans a sense of national purpose and identity that transcended regional differences, at least temporarily. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. The question of slavery and its expansion into new territories would soon threaten to tear the young nation apart. And in Latin America, the hard realities of nation building were proving even more difficult than winning independence had been. For ordinary people throughout the Americas, daily life remained a struggle for survival. Whether you were a pioneer clearing land in Kentucky, a freed slave in Haiti trying to build a life after revolution, or an indigenous person in Mexico watching your world transform around you, the dawn of the 1820s brought both new opportunities and new challenges. The age of revolution was ending. The age of nation building was just beginning, and it would prove every bit as bloody and complex as the fight for independence had been. So here's the thing about revolutions. They're actually the easy part. No, seriously. Getting everyone fired up to overthrow the oppressor, that's step 1. Building a functioning country afterward, that's where shit gets real. By 1825, most of Latin America had won independence, but now came the headache of figuring out how to actually govern. And spoiler alert, it didn't go smoothly. Imagine waking up in Caracas in 1830. The streets that once rang with revolutionary slogans are now filled with more practical concerns. The economy is in shambles after years of war. The government changes every few months, and the great liberator, Simón Bolívar, is dying. His dream of a united Spanish America shattered. You make your way to the central market, where prices for basic goods have tripled since independence. A woman argues with a vendor over the cost of cornmeal. 6 reals. 2 weeks ago it was 3. The vendor shrugs helplessly. The roads aren't safe. Bandits hit the last 2 shipments, and the new tax collector takes his cut too. A nearby soldier overhears and snorts. Tax collector? You mean Colonel Vargas's cousin who pockets half of what he collects? This was the reality across much of Latin America. Independence had created power vacuums, and into those vacuums stepped military strongmen called caudillos. These guys basically said, "I've got the guns, so I'm in charge now." One of these caudillos, Juan Manuel de Rosas of Argentina, ruled with an iron fist from 1829 to 1852. Rosas had this paramilitary group called La Mazorca that terrorized his political opponents. Not like, oh, they said mean things on Twitter. More like, they'll cut your throat in the street and leave your body as a warning to others. Did you hear what happened to Professor Echeverria? A university student whispers to his friend as they hurriedly walk through Buenos Aires. "They found him this morning," the friend replies, barely moving his lips. His tongue had been cut out. For a poem? They killed him for a poem? No, they killed him because Rosas can. That's the message. Both young men fall silent as a group of men wearing the red ribbons of Rosa's supporters passes by. That was the deal with caudillos. They maintained order, but at a terrible cost to civil liberties and democratic development, and they were everywhere. Antonio López de Santa Anna in Mexico, Rafael Carrera in Guatemala, Juan José Flores in Ecuador, Andrés Santa Cruz in Bolivia. Meanwhile, up north, the United States was going through its own growing pains, but with a big difference. Its governmental institutions were actually functioning. The peaceful transfer of power from one president to another was becoming routine, something that was decidedly not happening in Latin America. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president, marking the beginning of what historians call Jacksonian democracy. Jackson styled himself as the champion of the common man against the elite, which is kind of ironic considering he owned slaves and was a wealthy plantation owner, but whatever. Imagine standing in the mud of Pennsylvania Avenue on March 4th, 1829, Jackson's inauguration day. The crowd is unlike anything seen before at a presidential inauguration. Instead of just the upper crust, thousands of ordinary citizens have come to see their president take office. Never seen so many common folk at one of these. A well-dressed Georgetown resident remarks disdainfully, lifting his polished boots from the muck. "Get used to it," replies a rough-hewn man in homespun clothing. "It's our government now." After the ceremony, Jackson opened the White House to the public for a reception. It turned into absolute chaos. People stood on furniture in muddy boots, broke china, grabbing for refreshments, and generally trashed the place. Jackson himself had to escape through a window. "My God," a Supreme Court justice exclaims, watching the mayhem from a corner. "The people are in power. This is mob rule." His companion, a European diplomat, looks bemused. "In my country, we fear the mob might storm the palace. Here, you invite them in for drinks." The Jackson era saw massive changes in American politics. Voting rights expanded for white men as property requirements were dropped. Political parties became more organized and campaigns more raucous. Democracy was getting rowdier and more inclusive, if you were white and male, that is. For Native Americans, though, Jackson's presidency was nothing short of catastrophic. Jackson, the frontier Indian fighter, had built much of his reputation on conflicts with indigenous peoples, and he had his eye on their land. In Georgia, the Cherokee Nation had done everything the US government had asked of them. They had adopted farming, established schools, created a written language, drafted a constitution, and even owned slaves, adopting the practices of their white neighbours. Their newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, was published in both Cherokee and English. But none of that mattered when gold was discovered on their land in 1828. Georgia moved to strip the Cherokee of their territory, and Jackson supported them despite Supreme Court rulings in favour of Cherokee sovereignty. John Marshall has made his decision, Jackson reportedly said of the Chief Justice's ruling. Now let him enforce it. Spoiler alert, Marshall couldn't enforce it. The executive branch controls the army, not the judiciary. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which gave the president authority to negotiate with southern tribes for their removal to federal territory west of the Mississippi River. Some went peacefully, seeing the writing on the wall. Others, like the Cherokee, fought through legal means, but ultimately lost. Dawn breaks cold and grey over a Cherokee village in Georgia. It's May 1838, and US soldiers are everywhere, rounding up families and forcing them into crude stockades. A Cherokee mother frantically stuffs a few possessions into a blanket as soldiers approach her cabin. 2 minutes, the sergeant barks. Take what you can carry. But our farm, our home, her husband begins. Not yours anymore, the sergeant cuts him off. A white family moves in next week. Get moving. The Cherokee were forced to march over 1,000 miles to present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way from disease, exhaustion, and exposure. Similar forced relocations happened to the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole. Collectively, these brutal journeys became known as the Trail of Tears. I fought alongside Jackson against the British, an elderly Cherokee chief tells his grandson as they trudge westward. I saved white settlers during the Creek War, and this is how they repay us. The boy, thin from weeks of inadequate rations, looks up at him. Will we ever go home, grandfather? The old man looks away. Some questions are too painful to answer. While all this was happening, the American economy was transforming. The 1820s and 1830s saw the beginning of what historians call the market revolution, a shift from local subsistence farming to commercial agriculture and early industrialization. Imagine waking up in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1835. You're a young woman, a mill girl, who has left the family farm to work in the textile factories. The bell rings at 4:30 a.m. calling you to your 14-hour workday. You share a cramped company boarding house with a dozen other young women. The noise of the looms has already made you partially deaf at age 19. The cotton fibres in the air leave you constantly coughing, but you earn actual wages, about $3.50 a week, which gives you an independence your mother never dreamed of. Sometimes I think my lungs will burst from the dust, one mill girl writes to her sister back on the farm. But last week I bought a book of poetry with my own money. Can you imagine that? My own book purchased with money I earned myself. It wasn't just factories changing the economy. New canals and eventually railroads were shrinking the country, bringing distant markets closer together. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to New York City and the Atlantic, dramatically reducing the cost of shipping goods. But the market revolution didn't reach everywhere equally. The South remained primarily agricultural and increasingly committed to a single crop, cotton, and cotton meant slavery. By 1840, the United States was producing 2/3 of the world's cotton, almost all of it grown and harvested by enslaved people. Cotton was America's leading export, and the labor of the enslaved was making the country rich. The latest figures show our cotton exports at $64 million last year, a Charleston merchant tells his colleagues at their private club. That's more than all other exports combined. And still the abolitionists prattle on about the immorality of our labour system. Another man scoffs. I wonder if they consider the immorality of economic ruin. What would become of American trade without our cotton? What these men conveniently ignored was the human cost of that cotton. Enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset in brutal conditions. Families were routinely torn apart as planters sold off individuals to pay debts or maximize profits. Resistance was met with savage violence. Dawn breaks over a cotton plantation in Mississippi. The enslaved workers are already in the fields, backs bent under the already hot sun. An overseer on horseback watches their every move. "Move faster, Eli," he calls to an older man struggling to keep pace. "You're falling behind." "Sorry, massa," Eli says, his voice carefully neutral. "These old bones don't work like they used to." The overseer's whip cracks over Eli's back. "Then I'll give them some encouragement." That night, in the slave quarters, a young woman applies a poultice of herbs to Eli's lacerated back. "Why don't we run, Uncle Eli?" she whispers. "Head north to freedom?" Eli winces as the herbs sting his open wounds. 3 tried last month, caught by the dogs, 2 hanged, 1 sold downriver. Freedom's a long way from Mississippi, girl. Back in Latin America, the new nations were struggling with their own challenges. Political instability was endemic. Most countries cycled through multiple constitutions and governments in their first decades of independence. The exception was Brazil, which had taken a different path to independence. When Napoleon invaded Portugal in 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, effectively moving the capital of the empire to Rio de Janeiro. When they returned to Portugal in 1821, the king's son Pedro stayed behind and declared himself emperor of an independent Brazil the following year. This meant Brazil achieved independence without the devastating wars that ravaged Spanish America. It also meant Brazil remained a monarchy while its neighbours all became republics, at least on paper. But Brazil shared one crucial feature with the rest of Latin America, an economy built on slave labour. Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other American nation, nearly 5 million people over 3 centuries. Slavery wouldn't be abolished there until 1888, making it the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so. Dawn breaks over a sugar plantation outside Bahia, Brazil. The enslaved workers are already cutting cane, their machetes flashing in the early light. The work is brutally hard, the sun merciless. A Portuguese overseer watches from the shade of a tree, occasionally shouting orders. Nearby, the plantation owner discusses business with a British merchant. "We can increase production by 20% this year," the owner says. "I've purchased 40 new Africans, strong ones." "Excellent," the British man replies. "London can't get enough of your sugar, though I should warn you there's increasing talk in Parliament about enforcing the ban on the slave trade." The plantation owner waves dismissively. "They've been talking for years. Meanwhile, the ships keep coming. Business is business." Indeed, Britain had outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, but continued to profit enormously from slave-produced goods. It was a moral compromise that allowed Britons to feel righteous while still reaping the economic benefits of slave labour. Mexico, meanwhile, was facing its own set of problems. After winning independence in 1821, the country had briefly been an empire under Agustin de Iturbide, then a republic, then effectively a dictatorship under Antonio López de Santa Anna, who served as president 11 different times between 1833 and 1855. But Mexico's biggest challenge was holding on to its vast northern territories, which were increasingly attracting American settlers, especially to the region known as Texas. In the 1820s, Mexico had actively encouraged American immigration to Texas, offering land grants to settlers who agreed to become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, and obey Mexican law. Thousands of Americans took them up on the offer, led by impresarios, land agents, like Stephen F. Austin. But these American settlers never fully integrated into Mexican society. They kept their Protestant faith, their English language, and their American customs. And most problematically for Mexico, many brought slaves, despite the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. By 1835, there were about 30,000 American settlers in Texas, outnumbering Tejanos, Mexicans in Texas, by a ratio of 10 to 1. Conflict was inevitable. Imagine standing in the central plaza of San Antonio de Bexar, now just San Antonio, in October 1835. The town is tense with rumors of approaching Mexican troops. American settlers and some Tejanos who favor greater autonomy from the central government are preparing for confrontation. A rider gallops into town, pulling his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust. "Santa Anna's coming himself," he announces to the gathering crowd, "with an army of thousands, says he'll make no quarter for rebels." "Then we'll give him none in return," shouts a tall frontiersman, spitting tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. A Tejano rancher steps forward, his expression troubled. "I have no love for Santa Anna, but are we truly ready to break from Mexico, to start a war?" The American settler turns to him. "The war's already started, amigo. Santa Anna made sure of that when he threw out the Constitution of 1824. This was the Texian, Anglo-Texan view, that Santa Anna had become a dictator by discarding the Federalist Constitution and centralizing power. From the Mexican perspective, the American settlers were ungrateful colonists who had accepted Mexican hospitality only to steal a massive chunk of national territory. Both sides had a point. The resulting Texas Revolution gave us the famous Battle of the Alamo in February-March 1836, where a small force of Texians and Tejanos held out for 13 days against Santa Anna's much larger army before being overrun and killed. The brutal nature of the defeat, Santa Anna ordered no prisoners taken, became a rallying cry. "Remember the Alamo?" 6 weeks later, Texian forces under Sam Houston surprised Santa Anna's army at San Jacinto, crushing them in a battle that lasted just 18 minutes and capturing Santa Anna himself. Under duress, Santa Anna signed treaties recognizing Texan independence. "You realize this isn't the end," a Mexican officer tells Houston after the Texian victory. "Mexico will never willingly surrender Texas." Houston looks out over the battlefield where hundreds of Mexican soldiers lie dead. "Your government may not accept it, but the facts on the ground have changed. Texas is free, whether Mexico acknowledges it or not." The Republic of Texas would remain an independent nation for nearly a decade before being annexed by the United States in 1845, a move that would directly lead to war between the US and Mexico. While Texas was fighting for independence, the United States faced a severe economic crisis. The Panic of 1837 began with a collapse in cotton prices, followed by a general financial meltdown that plunged the country into a depression that lasted until 1843. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. In a New York tenement, a family gathers around their meager dinner, a thin soup with a few vegetables. "Any luck today, Pa?" the eldest son asks his father. The man shakes his head, his eyes downcast. The docks were full of men looking for work, hundreds of us for just a few positions. "Tomorrow I'll try the factories again." His wife touches his arm gently. "We still have the children's shoes to sell if things get worse." This depression highlighted a growing division in American society. While previous economic downturns had affected mostly merchants and investors, the increasingly interconnected market economy meant that this crisis hit workers hard. Labor activism grew as conditions worsened. By 1840, the American political landscape was dominated by two parties: the Democrats, heirs to Jackson's populist approach, and the Whigs, who favored a more activist federal government that would promote economic development through infrastructure projects and protective tariffs. The election that year saw the Whig candidate William Henry Harrison defeat the Democratic incumbent Martin Van Buren, who had been saddled with blame for the economic crisis. Harrison's campaign was notable for its use of symbols and slogans rather than substantive policy discussions, a harbinger of modern political marketing. They're calling Harrison the log cabin and hard cider candidate, a newspaper editor tells his assistant, as if he's some common frontiersman, not the son of a wealthy Virginia planter who lives on a 3,000-acre estate. "But it's working," the assistant points out. "People want to vote for someone they'd like to have a drink with, not a dandy in a fine coat." God help the Republic if that becomes the standard for choosing our leaders. Harrison won the election but served as president for just 1 month before dying of pneumonia, likely contracted during his long, rain-soaked inaugural address. His vice president, John Tyler, took office but quickly alienated his own party by vetoing much of their legislative agenda. By the mid-1840s, the United States and its neighbors stood at a crossroads. The American experiment in Republican government had survived its first half-century, but deep divisions remained, particularly over slavery and its expansion. The Latin American nations were still finding their footing, cycling through constitutions and leaders as they sought stability. And on the horizon loomed a concept that would dramatically reshape the continent: manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across North America would drive the next phase of continental development with momentous consequences for all the peoples of the Americas. Not like your cozy, peaceful bed right now, no territorial disputes or economic panics to worry about, just the gentle flow of history washing over you as you drift towards sleep. By 1845, a new phrase was on everyone's lips in America: manifest destiny. Coined by newspaper editor John O'Sullivan, it captured the growing belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand across the entire continent, spreading its institutions and civilization from Atlantic to Pacific. But let's be real about what manifest destiny actually meant. It wasn't just some lofty philosophical concept, it was a convenient justification for taking land from Mexico and Native Americans. It was an excuse wrapped in destiny, God, and progress. "It is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent," a politician declares to enthusiastic applause at a rally in St. Louis. Afterward, a farmer approaches him. "So God himself wants us to have California." The politician claps him on the shoulder. "My friend, the Almighty has been a good Democrat since the days of Jefferson." Manifest destiny went beyond political rhetoric. It tapped into something primal in the American psyche, this hunger for land, for opportunity, for movement. The idea of the frontier as a place of rebirth and reinvention had become central to American identity. But one man's destiny is another man's catastrophe. For Native Americans, it meant further displacement. For Mexico, it meant watching hungrily as American settlers poured into their northern territories. And for enslaved black Americans, it raised the terrifying prospect of slavery expanding into new lands. When President James K. Polk took office in 1845, he was determined to make Manifest Destiny a reality. Polk wanted Oregon, then jointly occupied by Britain and the US, and he wanted the Mexican territories of California and New Mexico, and he was willing to fight for them. The Oregon question was settled relatively peacefully. Britain and the US agreed to divide the territory at the 49th parallel, giving the US what would become Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, while Britain kept what would become British Columbia. Mexico was another story. In 1845, the US annexed Texas, which had been an independent republic for 9 years. Mexico had never recognized Texan independence and considered this an act of war. To make matters worse, Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border, while Mexico insisted the boundary was the Nueces River further north. Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed zone between the rivers. When Mexican forces attacked a US patrol in April 1846, Polk had his pretext for war. American blood has been shed on American soil, Polk declared, conveniently ignoring that the American soil in question was actually disputed territory that had a pretty strong claim to being Mexican. Congress declared war, though not without opposition. A young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln demanded to know exactly where American blood had been shed, suspecting, correctly, that Polk had deliberately provoked the conflict. "Show me the spot," Lincoln demanded repeatedly, but most Americans were swept up in war fever, and Lincoln's objections were dismissed as unpatriotic. Imagine you're in a small village outside Mexico City in September 1847. For weeks, you've heard reports of the American army advancing toward the capital. Now the rumble of artillery can be heard in the distance. Your husband, a potter, has joined the local militia to defend the city. "Will the Americans kill us all?" your 7-year-old daughter asks as you hurriedly pack a few belongings. You try to smile reassuringly. "No, my love, they want our land, not our lives." "Then where will we live?" You have no answer for that. The Mexican-American War was relatively short, just under 2 years, but brutally one-sided. The US invaded from multiple directions, captured Mexico City, and forced Mexico to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848. Mexico ceded more than half its territory, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. The United States paid $15 million, which sounds like a bargain basement price for what would become some of the most valuable real estate on Earth. "We have taken away half their country," an American diplomat remarks to a colleague after the treaty signing. "They should be grateful we didn't take it all," his companion replies. "There were those who wanted to." For Mexicans living in the ceded territories, the treaty promised US citizenship and protection of property rights. In reality, many found their land claims challenged in American courts, their culture marginalized, and their new citizenship hollow. A Mexican landowner in California stares at the legal document informing him that his land grant, recognized for generations by Spanish and Mexican authorities, is being challenged in American courts. "But this land has been in my family since my grandfather's time," he protests to the American lawyer he's hired. "I have the papers." The lawyer sighs. "The court wants the originals in Spanish and English, with witnesses to verify every signature. And the proceedings will be in English, which you don't speak. How much will this cost me?" "More than most can afford." thousands of Mexican landowners would lose their property through legal proceedings they couldn't navigate or afford to fight. But something else happened in early 1848 that would transform California more dramatically than the war itself. On January 24th, just 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, a carpenter named James Marshall found gold flakes in the mill race at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. By the end of 1849, the California gold rush was in full swing. More than 100,000 people flooded into California from all over the world, from the eastern United States, Latin America, Europe, Australia, and China. San Francisco grew from a sleepy port of about 1,000 people to a boom town of 25,000 in just 2 years. Picture this: San Francisco Harbor, 1849. The bay is literally filled with abandoned ships, hundreds of them stretching to the horizon. Why abandoned? Because the entire crews, from captains to cabin boys, deserted to go search for gold the minute they docked. Some ships were later dragged ashore and turned into buildings. Others were left to rot. "I've never seen anything like it," a newly arrived merchant from Boston tells his companion as they survey the chaotic waterfront. "It's as if the rules of civilization have been suspended." His companion, a grizzled man who arrived 6 months earlier, laughs. "Rules? The only rule here is gold. Get it any way you can." Life in the goldfields was brutal. Most miners lived in makeshift canvas tents, worked in ice-cold streams all day, ate terrible food at outrageous prices, and rarely struck it rich. Disease was rampant. Violence was common. Indigenous people were massacred if they happened to be near where gold was found. "I've been at this for 8 months, a miner tells a newcomer, showing him how to work a pan in a freezing stream. "Found enough to keep going, not enough to go home." "Is it worth it?" asks the newcomer, his hands already blistered from the pan handle. The miner looks around at the mud, the crude tents, the hollow-eyed men. "Ask me again in a year if I'm still alive." For all the hardship and chaos, the gold rush transformed California. It became a state in 1850, just 2 years after being acquired from Mexico, skipping the usual territorial phase entirely. Its population exploded, its economy boomed, and its society became uniquely diverse, with people from all over the world thrown together in pursuit of instant riches. But California's admission to the Union raised a thorny political question. Would it be a free state or a slave state? California wanted to enter as a free state, which would upset the delicate balance between slave and free states that had kept the peace in Congress for decades. The solution was the Compromise of 1850, a package of 5 bills that admitted California as a free state, allowed the territories of New Mexico and Utah to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty, ended the slave trade but not slavery in the District of Columbia, and created a tough, new Fugitive Slave Act requiring citizens in free states to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. This last provision infuriated Northerners who had previously been content to ignore the slavery issue. Now they were legally obligated to help return escaped human beings to bondage. Picture a small town in Ohio, 1851. A church meeting hall is packed with angry citizens. A local minister stands at the pulpit, his face flushed with indignation. "This law asks us to violate God's commandment to shelter the oppressed," he thunders. "It makes us agents of sin." A skeptic calls from the back, "But it's the law of the land. We can't just pick and choose which laws to follow." An older woman stands, her voice steady. "There is a higher law than any made in Washington, and I, for one, will answer to that higher law when my time comes." The Fugitive Slave Act radicalized many previously moderate Northerners, swelling the ranks of the abolitionist movement. It also inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that humanized enslaved people for many white readers and became a sensation when published in 1852. "Have you read this?" a Boston woman asks, holding up the book at a social gathering. "I wept for hours." "Pure abolitionist propaganda," scoffs a businessman. "Slander against the South." "Have you actually read it?" she challenges. He looks uncomfortable. "I don't need to read it to know what it says. Perhaps that's precisely why you should." While the political class was absorbed with these controversies, ordinary Americans were experiencing the first stirrings of what would later be called the Industrial Revolution. Factories were spreading in the Northeast, railroads were beginning to connect cities, and telegraph lines were creating the first instantaneous communication network in human history. Dawn breaks over a railroad construction site in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of workers, many of them Irish immigrants, are already swinging picks and shovels. The foreman, a harsh-faced man with a timepiece, watches their every move. "Sullivan," he barks at one labourer, "you're falling behind." The worker, his clothes ragged and face gaunt, picks up his pace. He arrived from Ireland just months ago, fleeing the devastating potato famine that killed 1 million people and forced 1 million more to emigrate. Like many Irish immigrants, he faced no Irish need apply signs until finding work on the railroads, where the brutal, dangerous labour made employers less picky. "How much longer on this section?" asks a well-dressed investor visiting the site. 3 weeks, weather permitting," the foreman replies. "We lose a few men a week to accidents, but there are always more looking for work." The investor nods, calculating profits in his head, not bodies. Railways were transforming America's sense of time and space. Journeys that had taken weeks by wagon now took days by train, but the human cost of this progress was steep. Railroad work was incredibly dangerous. Workers died in explosions, tunnel collapses, bridge failures, and equipment accidents. Meanwhile, in the South, life continued to be defined by agriculture, particularly cotton. By 1850, cotton made up nearly 60% of American exports. The South was supplying 75% of the world's cotton, almost all of it grown by enslaved labor. The immense profits from this white gold reinforced the South's commitment to slavery, even as the rest of the Western world moved toward abolition. Southern intellectuals, who had once apologetically described slavery as a necessary evil, now began defending it as a positive good for both enslaved people and society at large. Morning on a cotton plantation in Alabama, 1852, an overseer moves between the rows of cotton plants, watching the enslaved workers pick the fluffy bolls and stuff them into large sacks dragged behind them. The summer sun is merciless. "You there, Bessie?" he calls to an older woman who has slowed her pace. "Pick faster or taste the whip." The woman doesn't look up, just moves her fingers more quickly through the cotton plants, ignoring the cuts from the sharp bowl casings. She's been doing this work for 40 years, since she was a child. Her back is permanently bent from decades of stooping. That night in the slave quarters, Bessie tells stories to the children, not about Africa, which she knows only from her grandmother's tales, but about freedom. "Someday," she whispers, "someday we won't be anyone's property. We'll work for ourselves, live for ourselves." A boy of about 7 looks up at her skeptically. "How you know that, Granny Bess?" She smiles mysteriously. "I just know. Now go to sleep. Tomorrow comes early." While the United States was expanding westward, Mexico was struggling to rebuild after its devastating defeat in the war. The loss of half its territory was a national trauma that still resonates in Mexican culture today. The war also exacerbated political divisions within Mexico, setting the stage for another period of civil conflict. In 1853, Santa Anna returned to power for the 11th and final time. Desperate for funds, he sold another chunk of what is now southern Arizona and New Mexico to the United States for $10 million in what became known as the Gadsden Purchase. This was the last major territorial acquisition in the continental United States. Meanwhile, in Central America, a fascinating drama was unfolding. An American adventurer named William Walker was attempting to establish his own personal empire through military force. In 1855, Walker led a small private army into Nicaragua, took advantage of a civil war there, and briefly made himself president. He reinstated slavery, which Nicaragua had abolished decades earlier, and dreamed of creating a slave-holding empire in Central America dominated by white Americans. Walker was eventually defeated by a coalition of Central American nations, aided by the British. He was executed by firing squad in Honduras in 1860, but his bizarre adventure highlighted the growing American interest in dominating the hemisphere, which would only intensify in the decades to come. Back in the United States, the fragile peace established by the Compromise of 1850 was about to be shattered. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the Central Plains into the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing popular sovereignty to decide the slavery question in these territories. This meant slavery could potentially expand into areas where it had been prohibited for over 30 years. Anti-slavery forces were outraged. The act split the Democratic Party and gave birth to the new Republican Party, dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery into the territories. The stage was now set for a showdown between North and South over the future of slavery in America, and it would begin in Kansas, where pro- and anti-slavery forces were about to turn a territory into a battleground. But that story, with all its blood and fire, will have to wait for now. Not like your warm, peaceful bed, with no territorial disputes or slavery controversies to worry about. Just the gentle flow of history washing over you, carrying you toward sleep. In the span of just 9 years, from 1845 to 1854, the United States had physically transformed itself. It had expanded all the way to the Pacific, acquired vast territories from Mexico, discovered gold in California, built railroads linking east and west, and laid the foundations for the coming Industrial Revolution. But the nation had also sown the seeds of a catastrophic civil conflict. The question of slavery's expansion had moved from a political issue to a moral crusade. Compromise was becoming impossible, and the next decade would see whether the American experiment in self-government could survive its greatest test. When Senator Stephen Douglas pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress in 1854, he thought he was being clever. Let the people in each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. Democracy in action, right? What could possibly go wrong? Everything could go wrong. The ink was barely dry on the bill when both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers started pouring into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote. Except they weren't really interested in voting, they were interested in fighting. Free soilers coming in from Massachusetts, a pro-slavery settler warns his neighbors at a meeting in a Missouri border town, armed to the teeth and talking about making Kansas free. "Then we'll just have to be better armed," another man replies, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "I say we head over there and show them what Missourians think about that." These weren't empty threats. Pro-slavery Missourians crossed into Kansas in large numbers, many just to vote illegally in territorial elections, others to intimidate and attack anti-slavery settlers. They became known as border ruffians, and they helped pro-slavery forces win the first territorial elections, though the voting was so fraudulent it was basically meaningless. Anti-slavery settlers, meanwhile, set up their own rival government. By 1856, Kansas had 2 territorial capitals, 2 constitutions, and 0 chance of resolving things peacefully. The violence started small, a beating here, a burned cabin there. Then, in May 1856, a pro-slavery posse sacked the Free State town of Lawrence, destroying printing presses and looting homes. The response came from a figure who would become legendary in American history, though not in a good way, John Brown, an intense Old Testament-style abolitionist who believed God had chosen him to end slavery by any means necessary. 3 days after the sack of Lawrence, Brown led a small group, including 4 of his sons, to Pottawatomie Creek, where they dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their cabins in the middle of the night and hacked them to death with broadswords. Yes, broadswords. In 1856, a teenage boy stumbles through the pre-dawn darkness, his bare feet bloody from running through the woods. He pounds on the door of a neighbor's cabin. "Help!" he cries, his voice breaking with terror. They killed Pa and Mr. Doyle and his boys too. The cabin door opens a crack, a rifle barrel showing first. Who killed them? Old Brown and his sons. They had swords. They made Pa watch while they... The boy breaks down, sobbing. The man opens the door wider, pulling the boy inside. "Jesus Christ," he whispers, looking out at the darkness. "What kind of monsters are we dealing with?" The Pottawatomie Massacre, as it became known, kicked off a summer of guerrilla warfare in Kansas that left about 200 people dead. Newspapers called it Bleeding Kansas, which sounds like a nice, neat historical term now, but was literally describing blood soaking into prairie soil. But violence wasn't confined to the frontier. It reached into the hallowed halls of Congress itself. In May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, in which he insulted several pro-slavery senators, including Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Butler's cousin, Congressman Preston Brooks, decided family honor demanded satisfaction, but instead of challenging Sumner to a duel, as Southern code might normally dictate, Brooks decided Sumner wasn't worthy of that courtesy. Instead, he walked into the Senate chamber while Sumner was working at his desk and beat him nearly to death with a gold-headed walking stick. Sumner was so badly injured he couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. Brooks received hundreds of replacement canes from admiring Southerners, many inscribed with phrases like "hit him again." The next morning, a congressman from Ohio confronts Brooks in the Capitol corridor. "What you did was the act of a coward," he says, his hand resting on the pistol in his coat pocket. "To strike a man unaware, seated at his desk." Brooks smirks. The only language abolitionists understand is a good thrashing. Do you wish to defend Sumner's honor further? The Northern congressman considers the armed Southern friends flanking Brooks. "This isn't over," he says finally, walking away. "It most certainly is not," Brooks calls after him. The caning of Sumner showed just how dangerously divided the nation had become. Northerners were horrified by the attack. Southerners largely celebrated it. The two sections of the country were no longer seeing the same reality. While America was tearing itself apart over slavery, Latin America was going through its own transformations. In Mexico, liberals led by Benito Juarez were fighting conservatives in the Reform War, 1857-1861, a struggle over the power of the Catholic Church, indigenous rights, and land reform. Dawn breaks over Mexico City in 1858. A woman kneels in prayer in a small chapel, her rosary moving through her fingers. Outside, gunfire echoes sporadically. A priest enters, his expression grim. "Senora Mendoza, you should go home. The liberal forces are advancing into the city." And if they take the city, Father, what then? They will confiscate church lands, close monasteries and convents. They say the church has too much power. She crosses herself. These are dark times. The priest nods solemnly. Pray for Mexico. We are tearing ourselves apart. Meanwhile, far to the south, Argentina was finally unifying after decades of civil conflicts between Federalists and Unitarians. In 1861, Buenos Aires would reluctantly join the Argentine Confederation, creating the roughly unified Argentina we know today. In Brazil, still an empire under Dom Pedro II, coffee was becoming the dominant export, replacing sugar. This shifted economic power from the northeast to the south, particularly São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro provinces. Brazil's economy was still heavily dependent on slavery, though pressure to abolish the institution was growing. Back in the United States, the Supreme Court was about to drop a bombshell that would further inflame the slavery controversy. In March 1857, it issued its ruling in the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had been taken by his owner to live in Illinois, a free state, and Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was prohibited. After his owner's death, Scott sued for his freedom, arguing that residence on free soil had made him free. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, a Maryland slave owner, ruled that 1. Black people were not citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. 2. Living in free territory didn't make Scott free because the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. 3. Slave owners could take their property anywhere in the United States without losing ownership rights. It was everything the South had ever wanted, and the North's worst nightmare. A group of businessmen huddles around a newspaper in a Chicago office, reading the decision with increasingly grim expressions. "This can't stand," one says finally. "They've basically ruled that slavery can go anywhere, and that no black person, free or slave, has any rights," another adds. "The court says they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect." Those exact words. An older man shakes his head. "Gentlemen, we are watching the Constitution being twisted to strangle freedom. The question is what we do about it." The newest political party, the Republicans, knew exactly what to do about it: gain power and curb slavery's expansion. They found their voice in an unlikely figure, Abraham Lincoln, a prairie lawyer from Illinois who had served one unremarkable term in Congress a decade earlier. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. As part of their campaign, they held 7 debates focused largely on slavery. Lincoln didn't advocate immediate abolition, which was still a radical position, but argued that slavery should be put on a course toward eventual extinction by preventing its spread into new territories. During the 6th debate, in a town called Quincy, Lincoln stands before a crowd of thousands in the crisp autumn air. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," he declares. "I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel." Later, a farmer approaches Lincoln as he comes down from the platform. "You really believe the Negro is equal to the white man?" he asks skeptically. Lincoln regards him thoughtfully. "In the right to eat the bread his own hands have earned, he is the equal of any man, white or black. In other respects, our opinions may differ, but can we not agree that no man is good enough to govern another man without that other's consent?" Lincoln lost that Senate race, but the debates made him nationally famous. Meanwhile, tensions continued to escalate. In October 1859, John Brown, the same man who had murdered pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia. His plan was to seize weapons and spark a slave uprising across the South. The raid failed miserably. Brown was captured, tried for treason, and hanged on December 2, 1859, but his raid terrified the South and electrified the North, where many viewed him as a martyr. At his execution, Brown handed a note to his guard that read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." It was a prophetic statement. The 1860 presidential election took place in this atmosphere of mutual fear and suspicion. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern wings, each with their own candidate. A new constitutional union party emerged to offer a middle path, and the Republicans nominated Abraham Lincoln, who wasn't even on the ballot in most southern states. Lincoln won with just 40% of the popular vote, but a solid majority in the Electoral College. Before he could even take office, southern states began to secede from the Union. First to go was South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. By February 1861, 6 more had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as their president, and began seizing federal forts and arsenals within their borders. In Charleston, South Carolina, a crowd gathers outside the newspaper office on the evening of December 20th, waiting for news. A man emerges onto the balcony, waving a document. "The Ordinance of Secession has been signed," he shouts. "South Carolina is a free and independent commonwealth." Cheers erupt from the crowd. Church bells begin to ring across the city. A group of men fire pistols into the air. In the shadows across the street, an enslaved man watches silently, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. A white man jostles past him, nearly knocking him down. "Watch yourself, boy," the man snarls. "Things are changing around here." "Yes, massa," the enslaved man replies, eyes downcast. But when the white man moves on, he looks up again, watching the celebration with calculating eyes. Yes, things are changing, he thinks, perhaps in ways these celebrating men cannot imagine. President James Buchanan, a Northern Democrat with Southern sympathies, did virtually nothing to stop secession during his final months in office. He claimed he had no constitutional authority to coerce states back into the Union. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, 7 states had seceded, formed their own government, and seized most federal properties in their territories, except for a few key forts. The most important of these was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. In his inaugural address, Lincoln appealed for patience and peace, but also made it clear he would not accept secession. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But the bonds were already broken. A month later, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, forcing its surrender after a 34-hour bombardment. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. 4 more states seceded rather than contribute troops to fight their southern neighbors: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The Civil War had begun. For all the high-minded talk about states' rights and constitutional principles, the everyday reality for most Americans in the 1850s, in the mid-1800s in Victorian Britain, bare-knuckle boxers fought for over 100 rounds with no gloves, facing broken faces, mangled jaws, and certain death while the crowd roared. These fighters rose from the humblest working-class origins to become the greatest sporting superstars of their day, fighting for the honour to be the very first undisputed champion of the world. Here's what life was really like as a Victorian boxer. Okay, so, if you're here a lot, you know I ask for likes and subscribes, but seriously, where are you guys? Comment your location and time. Sometimes I see someone from California listening at 3 p.m. and I'm like, are you napping? Tonight's stop, Victorian boxing rings. Hold up though, get cozy first. Adjust those pillows. Pull up that blanket. Trust me, once we get going, you won't want to move. The blood is everywhere. On your knuckles, in your eyes, dripping down your chin. You blink hard, trying to clear your vision. The roar of the crowd comes in waves, one moment deafening, the next oddly distant. Your mouth tastes like copper pennies. 3 of your teeth feel loose, and your right eye has swollen nearly shut. Welcome to London 1847. You're a bare-knuckle boxer, and you're in the middle of the fight of your life. The man across from you doesn't look much better. His face is a mess of red pulp where your left hook connected 2 rounds ago. His nose sits at an unnatural angle. That was from round 17. You've been fighting for nearly 2 hours now, and neither of you shows any sign of quitting. Round 64, the timekeeper shouts. You think about the thin straw mattress waiting for you back in the room you rent above the Fighting Cock pub. Not like your warm, comfortable bed right now. Your actual home is barely more than a closet with a window, but it's the first place you've ever had to yourself, and you've earned every penny of the rent through blood and broken bones. "You okay there, Jackie boy?" your corner man whispers as he splashes water on your face between rounds. He's a former fighter himself, one eye milky white from an old injury, knuckles permanently swollen into gnarled lumps. "Never better," you croak, though your ribs scream in protest with each breath. I spent 3 months researching Victorian boxing for this story, and let me tell you, these guys were a different breed. Our modern boxers are tough, but these bare-knuckle fighters, absolutely insane levels of endurance. See, in today's boxing, you've got weight classes, padded gloves, rounds that last a clean 3 minutes with nice 1-minute breaks. But in Victorian bare-knuckle fighting, a round only ended when someone hit the ground. Could be 30 seconds, could be 15 minutes of non-stop punishment. The crazy part is that hitting the ground was often a strategy. When you needed a breather, you might take a light hit and go down deliberately just to get that 30-second recovery period. Imagine playing that game for 60, 70, sometimes over 100 rounds. "Time," the referee calls, and you're back on your feet, swaying slightly. Your opponent, Butcher Bill, they call him, lunges forward with a wild right hand. You see it coming. One benefit of fighting this long, you learn each other's patterns and slip to the side, letting his fist sail past your ear. The move costs him his balance, and you drive a sharp left into his exposed ribs. The crowd explodes. You can make out individual voices now. "Break his bloody jaw, boy. Finish him, Butcher. 10 quid on the young one." I know what you're thinking. Why would anyone do this? Good question. For most fighters, it was one of the only ways out of soul-crushing poverty. In Victorian Britain, if you were born poor, you'd almost certainly die poor, unless you had a special talent. And for some men, that talent was violence. Most bare-knuckle boxers came from the working class. Butchers, blacksmiths, dock workers, guys who grew up doing hard physical labour and fighting in the streets. For them, boxing wasn't just sport. It was one of the few chances to escape a life of grinding poverty. Take Tom Spring, born Tom Winter in rural Herefordshire in 1795. His father was a butcher, taught young Tom to box by making him punch a bag hanging from an apple tree. When legendary boxer Tom Cribb discovered him at an amateur match, Spring was offered the chance of a lifetime to train in London under the champion himself. At 18 years old, Spring left behind the only home he'd ever known for the smoke, noise and filth of London, a city that would chew up and spit out most country boys. "Jesus," you mutter as Butcher Bill lands a heavy blow to your shoulder. The impact sends a jolt of pain down to your fingertips. You clinch with him, grabbing his sweat-slick body to buy a moment's rest. Up close, you can smell the gin on his breath, the blood and sweat soaking both your bodies. His eye is swollen completely shut now, and a gash above his other eye keeps seeping blood despite his corner's attempts to close it. The referee breaks you apart and you resume the brutal dance. You're fighting at a place called the Fives Court, one of London's premier boxing venues. It's not much more than a large room with benches arranged in a square, but today it's packed with everyone from street urchins who snuck into actual aristocracy wearing silk top hats. That's the weird thing about boxing in this era. It draws from every social class, while working class folk crowd the back. The fancy, what they call boxing enthusiasts from the upper classes, sit up front in their fine clothes, betting obscene amounts of money on the outcome. And speaking of betting, the gambling on these fights is absolutely wild. More money might change hands during a championship bout than most workers would see in a lifetime. Prize fights were often called mills, as in they were money mills for gamblers and promoters. Lord Palmerston, the actual Prime Minister of Britain, was a huge boxing fan. So was Lord Byron, one of the most famous poets of the day. Charles Dickens wrote about prize fighting. These high society types slumming it at bloody bare-knuckle bouts is kinda like if today's tech billionaires and Hollywood celebrities were all obsessed with underground fight clubs. Butcher Bill's legs are looking wobbly now. You've been working his body for the last several rounds and it's starting to pay off. Your own arms feel like they're filled with lead, but you force yourself to keep them up. He's fading, your corner man hisses in your ear. Don't let up now. The thing about bare-knuckle fighting is that it was as much about endurance as power. Modern boxing matches go a maximum of 12 rounds, but Victorian fights, the famous 1860 championship bout between Tom Sayers and John Carmel Heenan, went for 37 punishing rounds over more than 2 hours, and it only ended because the crowd broke into the ring when Heenan started strangling Sayers over the ropes. I mean, picture that scene. Two guys have been beating each other senseless for hours, and then one starts choking the other with the ropes, and the crowd just loses it and storms the ring. The fight was declared a draw amid chaos, but both men were national heroes after that. Sayers in England and Heenan in America. You land a perfect right cross that snaps Butcher Bill's head back. For a moment he stands frozen, then his eyes roll back and he drops to the dirt floor like a sack of coal. The crowd erupts. Your cornerman leaps over the rope, lifting your arm in victory as the referee counts. Bill isn't getting up this time. Ladies and gentlemen, the ring announcer shouts. Your winner in 64 rounds, the fighting footman, Jack Riley. Money changes hands all around the room. You're too exhausted to celebrate properly, but you know what this means. A bigger purse, a better reputation, and matches against higher-ranked fighters. From a medical standpoint, these fights were absolute nightmares. One surgeon who studied the injuries said the punches could damage eyebrow, nose, rip off an ear, break teeth, smash jaw, and that a blow to the neck could fracture the windpipe and voice box. Broken ribs could puncture lungs, causing internal bleeding. And there were no real doctors at ringside, just experienced cornermen who might throw water on you, give you a sip of brandy, and maybe set a broken nose with their thumbs before sending you back out. Your cornerman wipes your face with a damp cloth. Good work, lad. Rest up. Promoter wants to talk terms for your next fight. And that's the business of it. No time to heal properly. Your body is your only asset, and you've got to keep fighting to earn. Most boxers from this era died young, from injuries, alcohol, or the general hard living that came with the fighting life. Back in your small room above the fighting cock, You inspect the damage. 2 possibly broken ribs, a gash above your left eye that probably needs stitches but will have to make do with a plaster, knuckles swollen to twice their normal size. You carefully unwrap the strips of cloth you bound your hands with before the fight. No gloves in bare-knuckle boxing, just thin strips of cloth to provide some minimal protection to the knuckles. Didn't help much. Your hands look like raw meat. The landlady, Mrs. Higgins, knocks and enters, without waiting for a response. She's carrying a basin of hot water and some clean rags. "Saw the fight," she says gruffly, setting down her supplies. "Not bad for a skinny lad. Need help with them cuts?" She doesn't wait for an answer, already dabbing at your face with a wet cloth. The water in the basin quickly turns pink. "Thank you, ma'am," you manage. "Don't thank me. Rent's going up a shilling now you're winning proper fights." She's not entirely joking, but her hands are surprisingly gentle as she cleans your wounds. Despite all its brutality, bare-knuckle boxing actually had rules. The London prize ring rules, established in the 1740s and refined in 1838. They banned eye gouging and biting. Yeah, they had to specifically outlaw those, but allowed wrestling moves, throws, and fibbing. Which is when you'd grab an opponent by the neck or hair and just pummel him repeatedly. Super civilized stuff, clearly. The training methods were just as brutal and rudimentary as the fighting itself. Fighters would run miles each day, often carrying weights. They'd punch bags filled with grain or sand. They'd spar without gloves to condition their hands. Diet wasn't exactly scientific either. A typical fighter's diet included lots of meat, especially beef and mutton, bread, vegetables, and beer. Yes, beer was considered training food. Some fighters would consume a gallon or more of beer daily during training, believing it provided strength and energy. In some ways, they weren't wrong. When your diet lacks calories and nutrition, the carbs and calories in beer actually helped. But obviously, the alcohol part wasn't doing them any favours for recovery. As you lie on your thin mattress that night, every inch of your body aching, you stare at the ceiling and calculate your earnings. After paying your trainer and cornermen, you've cleared £6, about half a year's wages for an average labourer, earned in a single afternoon. Not bad for a former footman who used to earn scraps serving aristocrats. Tomorrow you'll barely be able to move, but tonight you've got enough to eat well, pay your rent, and maybe even send something home to your mother. You drift off to sleep thinking about the next fight, the next opponent, the next chance to climb a little higher in this brutal world. This is the life you've chosen, or perhaps the life that chose you. Outside your window, London continues its chaotic dance. Street vendors hawking their wares, carriages clattering over cobblestones, drunken arguments spilling out from pubs. The greatest city in the world, filthy, glorious and unforgiving. In Victorian Britain, life was relentlessly hard for the working class. 12-hour workdays, 6 days a week, in factories, mines or docks. Children as young as 5 or 6 working alongside adults. No safety regulations, no healthcare, no safety net if you got injured. For someone with fighting skills, the prize ring offered a desperate sort of hope. Top fighters could earn more in one bout than most workers made in years, but it came at a terrible physical cost. Even the greatest champions rarely made it to old age. Tom Sayers, one of the most famous boxers of the era, died at 39 from tuberculosis, diabetes, and the effects of alcohol. His American opponent, John Carmel Heenan, made it to 38 before tuberculosis took him too. Yet when Sayers died, his funeral procession was one of the largest London had ever seen. Over 100,000 people lined the streets to pay their respects, a testament to how deeply prize fighting had embedded itself in Victorian culture. As your consciousness fades, you realise that for better or worse, you're part of this world now. The blood, the pain, the roaring crowd, the desperate gamble for a better life, all of it sewn together into the patchwork fate of a Victorian boxer. The last thought that passes through your mind before sleep claims you is simple. I wonder how long I can last in this game before it kills me. Unlike you in your comfortable modern bed right now, sleep for a Victorian boxer wasn't about relaxation but recovery. The desperate need to heal enough to fight again. As you drift off to sleep in your safe, warm home, miles and centuries away from those brutal rings, perhaps you can appreciate just how far we've come. And yet, something about their raw courage, their willingness to stand toe-to-toe and test the very limits of human endurance, still calls to something primal in us. Maybe that's why these stories of the first fighting champions still captivate us, even as we wince at their brutality. Sleep well. There's more to this story tomorrow. Dawn breaks through your grimy window, painting your small room in dirty gold. Your body screams in protest as you force yourself to sit up. Each breath sends daggers through your ribs. Your knuckles have scabbed overnight, tight and painful. This is the morning after victory. Feels a lot like defeat. Up, you lazy mongrel. A loud bang on your door. Ned Clark, your trainer. No rest for the wicked. You grunt in response, which he takes as an invitation to barge in. Ned's a tank of a man, 50 years old, with cauliflower ears and a permanently broken nose that whistles when he breathes. 20 years ago he was a champion. Now he makes champions, or tries to. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he says, surveying your battered face. You look like hammered shit. Feel worse, you manage, voice like gravel. Good. Pain means you're alive. He tosses a bundle onto your bed. Clean yourself up. Got you eggs and steak at the butcher's. You need red meat to build the blood back. This was actual medical advice in the 1840s, by the way. Fighters believed red meat built blood after a fight, and they weren't entirely wrong. The iron and protein did help recovery, even if they didn't understand the science behind it. See, medical knowledge around boxing injuries was primitive at best. No ice packs, no anti-inflammatories, no physical therapy, just raw eggs, red meat, whiskey for the pain, and maybe some herbal poultices your trainer swore by. Got us a meeting, Ned says, watching you struggle to pull on your shirt. Man with money wants to talk. 2 hours, the rose and crown. Not fighting again for weeks, you protest. Your body couldn't take it. Ned snorts. Course not, you daft bastard. You're meat for at least a month, but we need to strike while you're hot. Yesterday's win put eyes on you. The bundle he brought contains a fresh shirt, slightly too big but cleaner than anything you own, and a small jar of pungent-smelling salve. For them hands, he explains. Old gypsy remedy, horse fat, beeswax, and God knows what else. Don't ask, just rub it in. You force down breakfast at the pub downstairs. 3 barely cooked eggs and a slab of bloody steak. The protein helps, but your jaw aches with every chew. The landlady brings you tea with honey, a kindness you hadn't expected. For your throat, lad, she says. You took some hits there. This was the life cycle of a Victorian fighter. Brutal combat followed by desperate recovery, trying to heal enough before financial necessity forced you back into the ring. Many fought while still injured from previous bouts, accumulating damage that would eventually end their careers. Or their lives. While today's boxers might take months between fights, Victorian pugilists often fought every few weeks. The human body simply can't heal that quickly, especially without modern medicine. Every fighter carried injuries from their last bout into their next one. The cumulative damage was catastrophic. Walking to your meeting takes effort. Your legs are stiff, your back aches, and the bright morning light makes your head pound. Every passerby seems to stare, some with admiration, others with disgust. Your face is a public advertisement for your profession. The Rose and Crown is a step up from your usual haunts, cleaner with actual glass in the windows instead of oiled paper. Ned is already there, nursing a pint and chatting with a well-dressed gentleman. "Ah, here he is," Ned booms as you approach. "My promising young fighter, Jack Riley." The gentleman turns, appraising you with cold efficiency. He's maybe 40, wearing a tailored suit and gold watch chain. His hands are soft, uncalloused. He's never worked a day in his life. Not with those hands. "Mr. Holmes," Ned introduces him. "Businessman and sporting enthusiast. You've learned enough to know what that means. A gambler, a man who makes money from other men's blood." "Sit, young man," Holmes says, gesturing to a chair. "That was impressive work yesterday. 64 rounds against the butcher. Most wouldn't last 20. You mumble thanks, uncomfortable with his scrutiny. "I'll be direct," Holmes continues, sipping port despite the early hour mail. "You have talent, but no management. Mr. Clark here is an excellent trainer, but you need backing to reach the top ranks." He's not wrong. Boxing in Victorian England was as much about connections as talent. The best fights, the biggest purses, they went to fighters with powerful patrons, men who could arrange matches, handle promotion, place strategic bets. I should mention, these businessmen weren't always on the up and up. Boxing operated in a legal grey area, and many patrons had connections to gambling networks, criminal enterprises, and corrupt officials who could be paid to look the other way when a fight was arranged. "I can arrange 3 fights in the next year," Holmes explains. "Proper fights with proper purses. £200 for the first, 3 for the second, 5 for the third, assuming you win, of course." Your head spins at the numbers. £500 is a fortune, more than most working men would see in a decade. It's a path out of poverty, not just for you, but for your whole family. "What's your cut?" Ned asks bluntly. Holmes smiles thinly. 40% of winnings plus betting privileges. 30, Ned counters, and we get 10% of your betting profits. The two men haggle while you sit in silence, still trying to process what's happening. Yesterday you were fighting for a £6 purse, now they're discussing hundreds. "So he'd need to go to Bristol for the first fight," Holmes is saying. "There's a man there, Jenkins. Strong but slow. Good match for our boy." "Bristol," you finally speak up. "That's 100 miles. Holmes looks at you like you're a particularly slow child. "Yes, and Manchester for the second, likely London for the third. Did you think you'd become champion fighting the same dock workers and butchers' boys forever?" He has a point. The boxing circuit stretched across Britain, with fighters travelling between major cities for important bouts. This wasn't easy in the 1840s. Travel meant uncomfortable stagecoaches or the relatively new railways, which were still expensive. Many fighters had never travelled more than a few miles from their birthplace before boxing took them on the road. The meeting ends with handshakes and a signed agreement, your X mark on a document you can't read, promising your fighting future to a man you just met. Ned seems pleased, though, and you trust his judgment more than your own in these matters. "This changes everything," he tells you as you leave. "No more back alley scraps. You're moving up, Jackie boy." The deal made, Ned drags you to his training quarters, a converted stable behind another pub. Despite your protests that you need to rest, he insists you start preparing immediately. Champion ain't made in the ring, he says, handing you a rope. Champion's made in training. You start skipping, an exercise fighters have used for centuries to build footwork and stamina. Every jump sends pain through your ribs, but you grit your teeth and continue. After 10 minutes, you're drenched in sweat and struggling to breathe. Pathetic, Ned comments, though not unkindly. 5 more minutes, then the bag. The bag is a canvas sack filled with sand, hanging from a beam. Not the refined equipment of modern gyms. This thing is hard as stone and rough enough to take more skin off your already damaged knuckles. Not with the hands, you protest, showing him your split knuckles. Then practice blocking, he says without sympathy. Arms up, elbows in, move your feet. You took too many hits yesterday because you stand flat-footed like a damn statue. Victorian training methods were brutal but effective in their own way. They didn't have the scientific understanding of exercise physiology we have today, but they recognized the fundamentals. Build strength, improve endurance, develop technique through endless repetition. A typical training regimen involved running, often while carrying weights, skipping rope for footwork and stamina, punching heavy bags or pads, sparring, though not too often before fights, weight work with primitive dumbbells or medicine balls, diet focused on meat and bread for protein and energy. By noon, you're completely spent. Ned finally relents, sending you to sit while he brings bread and cheese for lunch. You did good yesterday, he says, his gruff voice softening slightly. Real good, but Jenkins is a different class of fighter. He's been at it 10 years, fought everyone from Liverpool to Plymouth, knows every dirty trick in the book. You think I can beat him? You ask between mouthfuls. Ned considers this, head tilted. If we train right and fight smart, yeah. You're faster, younger, hungrier, but he'll hurt you worse than the butcher did. Need to be ready for that. The next few weeks fall into a painful rhythm. Up at dawn for a 5-mile run, regardless of weather. Breakfast of eggs, steak, and bread. 2 hours of bag work, skipping and strength exercises. Rest at midday, then more training in the afternoon. Sparring twice weekly with local fighters Ned brings in. Your hands never fully heal. A fighter's hands rarely did in this era. Instead, the skin over your knuckles gradually hardens into callus, bones underneath permanently swollen. You learn to ignore the constant pain, to fight through it. One evening, Ned takes you to a gentleman's club. Not the kind with dancing girls, but the kind with rich men in smoking jackets. You feel profoundly out of place in your clean but threadbare clothes, standing awkwardly while Ned talks to potential backers. Just stand there and look dangerous, he had instructed you. Don't talk unless asked a direct question. These toffs want a fighting animal, not a conversation partner, and that's exactly how they treat you, like a prized but slightly dangerous animal. They inspect your build, comment on your reach, discuss your prospects as if you're not standing right there. One man even grabs your arm without asking, squeezing your bicep to assess your strength. You nearly deck him on instinct before Ned's warning glare stops you. Strong lad, the man comments to Ned, but how's his stamina past 40 rounds? Like a bloody steam engine, Ned boasts. Butcher Bill couldn't break him in 64. I might put £50 on him for Bristol, if he looks good in training next week. This part of boxing hasn't changed much over the centuries. The uncomfortable dynamic where fighters, especially those from working class backgrounds, are treated as commodities by the moneyed classes who finance the sport. In Victorian England, this class divide was even more pronounced. Boxers were entertainment for the wealthy, who placed massive bets on the outcomes. Some aristocrats genuinely loved the sport and respected its participants, but many simply viewed fighters as vessels for gambling, disposable once they stopped winning. What has changed is the level of protection for the athletes. Modern boxers have managers, contracts, medical supervision. Victorian fighters had, well, men like Ned doing their best, but often out of their depth against the power brokers. "We leave for Bristol in 3 days, Ned tells you, as you walk home. Holmes is arranging everything. Train light tomorrow, rest the day after. Need you sharp." The journey to Bristol takes a full day by railway, your first time on a train. Under normal circumstances, you might have enjoyed the novelty. Instead, you spend the journey staring out the window, mind consumed with the coming fight. Jenkins has a reputation. They call him the Hammer, for his powerful right hand that's supposedly broken 3 men's jaws. 15 years in the prize ring, only 4 losses in over 30 fights. A local hero in Bristol with a passionate following. You're the unknown outsider, brought in as fresh meat. Bristol is bigger than you expected, a bustling port city with ships from around the world crowding its harbour. Holmes has arranged lodgings at an inn near the docks. Not fancy, but clean enough. You and Ned share a room to save money. The morning of the fight, you wake before dawn, stomach churning with nerves. Ned makes you eat. Dry toast and tea, nothing that might come back up in the ring. Then a short walk to loosen your muscles, careful not to tire yourself. The fight venue is a converted warehouse. By noon, it's packed with spectators, dock workers and merchants standing shoulder to shoulder with gentlemen in fine coats. The noise is deafening as you make your way to the ring, a simple roped-off square with sawdust covering the wooden floor. Jenkins is already there, circling inside the ropes. He's older than you expected, late 30s at least, with greying hair at his temples, but his body is a mass of ropey muscle, and his face is a roadmap of scar tissue. This man has absorbed more punishment than you've ever dealt out. The formalities are brief. The referee, a portly man with impressive whiskers, calls you both to the centre. Clean fight, gentlemen. No hits below the belt, no gouging. Fight ends when one man can't continue or concedes. Jenkins stares at you with flat, emotionless eyes. The eyes of a man who's done this too many times to feel anything anymore. "I'll try not to kill you, boy," he says quietly. No money in corpses. You return to your corner where Ned gives last-minute instructions you barely hear over the roaring in your ears. Then the bell rings, actually a hammer striking an iron bar, and it begins. Jenkins comes out cautiously, more technical than Butcher Bill. He circles, tests your defense with light jabs, looking for weaknesses. You respond in kind, remembering Ned's advice. First 5 rounds, just stay safe. Learn his patterns. He's old, make him work. The early rounds are tense but uneventful. Jenkins lands some solid hits, but nothing that puts you in danger. You connect with a few good counters that seem to surprise him with their speed. "He's slowing already," Ned whispers during a break. "Old legs, but watch that right hand. He's loading it up." Ding. Round 8 is when it happens. You slip a jab, step inside, and walk straight into the right hand Ned warned you about. It catches you perfectly on the jaw, a sledgehammer blow that makes your vision explode into white stars. You're on the floor without remembering how you got there. The count reaches 7 before you can force yourself back to your feet, legs wobbling like a newborn colt's. 8, 9, you fit to continue? The referee asks, peering into your eyes. You nod, unable to form words. Jenkins comes in for the kill, but some animal instinct for survival takes over. You clinch, hold, survive the round through desperation alone. Sit, breathe. Ned's voice seems to come from very far away as you collapse in your corner. He presses something cold against your jaw, a metal flask filled with water. The pain recedes slightly, enough to clear your head. "I'm okay," you mumble through a mouth that feels stuffed with cotton. "Like hell you are," Ned replies, but he used a lot of energy trying to finish you. Now he's the one breathing heavy. He's right. The next round, Jenkins charges forward, but his legs have slowed, his punches coming a fraction later than before. You focus on movement, circling away from that deadly right hand, jabbing when you can, making him chase you. 2 more rounds of this, and the dynamic has shifted completely. Jenkins is gasping for air, his shots growing wild as frustration mounts. The Bristol crowd senses the change, their cheers taking on a concerned edge. In round 12, you see your opening. Jenkins throws a looping right that misses entirely, leaving him off balance. You step in with a perfect left hook to his liver, a shot Ned drilled into you for weeks. The effect is immediate and dramatic. Jenkins folds like he's been stabbed, face contorted in agony. The liver shot, as boxers well know, causes a unique kind of pain that simply can't be fought through. There's no count needed. Jenkins remains kneeling, one glove raised in surrender. The Bristol crowd falls silent for one shocked moment, then erupts, some in cheers, others in angry shouts. You've just become the most hated man in the city and also the most respected. As Ned wraps a blanket around your shoulders and hustles you toward the exit, you catch Holmes watching from ringside. He's smiling as he collects what looks like a considerable amount of money from several ashen-faced gentlemen. "Did we just make an enemy?" you ask Ned, nodding toward the grumbling Bristol crowd. Ned grins, exposing his missing teeth. "Nah, you just made a reputation." In your room that night, counting your share of the purse, more money than you've ever possessed at one time, you realise something has fundamentally changed. You're not just fighting for survival anymore. You've entered a world where men like you can rise, can make a name, can perhaps even secure a future beyond the ring. It's a dangerous world, one that breaks most who enter it. But tonight, bandaging your hands and replaying the perfect liver shot that crumpled Jenkins, you allow yourself to believe you might be different. You might be the one who survives. On the train back to London the next morning, Ned spreads a newspaper between you. Your fight gets a full column, complete with a crude illustration of Jenkins kneeling in defeat. "The Fighting Footman Conquers Bristol," reads the headline. "You're famous now," Ned says, unable to hide his pride. "Manchester will be tougher though. Alan's a proper fighter, not an aging brawler like Jenkins." As the English countryside rolls past the window, you realise you've crossed a threshold. There's no going back to anonymity, to small fights in local pubs. For better or worse, you're now part of the spectacle of the prize ring, that bloody theatre where men like you live and die for the entertainment of others. And somewhere